That night at dinner, I heard words that cut deeper than any knife. My son-in-law leaned back in his chair, smirked, and asked me, "How does it feel to be a loser?" His words rolled off his tongue like poison, and suddenly the entire table erupted in laughter. My own family, my blood. They laughed at me as though my pain was some kind of entertainment. But I didn't flinch. I didn't argue. I didn't even raise my voice. I simply smiled, because deep inside, I knew something they didn't. That so-called loser they were mocking was the same woman who had paid their bills, kept food on their table, and carried burdens they never even saw. For years, I sacrificed silently. I skipped meals so my children could eat. I worked jobs that broke my back so they could live comfortably. I swallowed disrespect, insults, and silence, believing that love was enough to keep a family together. But sitting there at that dinner table, with their laughter echoing in my ears, I realized something very important. My silence had been mistaken for weakness. And on that night, I decided their mistake would cost them everything. The dining room was filled with the clinking of silverware, the low hum of conversation, and the kind of forced laughter families use when they're pretending everything is fine. I had cooked most of the meal myself, pot roast, roasted vegetables, fresh bread. But as I sat there, surrounded by people I loved more than life itself, I realized I was more of a guest than a mother. I could feel it in the way they looked past me, in the way my words carried no weight, in the way I had become invisible. And then it happened. My son-in-law, leaning back in his chair like he owned the world, let out a laugh that made the room stop. He tilted his glass, smirked at me, and said loud enough for everyone to hear, "So, tell me, how does it feel to be a loser?" The words hit me like a blade sliding between my ribs. The air left my lungs. For a moment, I wondered if I had misheard him, if perhaps I had imagined the cruelty behind his smile. But I hadn't. He meant it. Every syllable carried the weight of his arrogance, and when the others heard it, they didn't stop him. They didn't defend me. They laughed. My own children, my flesh and blood, laughed at the table. Their spouses laughed too. Even the grandchildren, too young to understand, giggled because everyone else was giggling. It was a symphony of betrayal. I sat there, frozen, staring at the faces I had raised, the faces I had kissed goodnight, the faces I had protected from storms, hunger, and heartbreak. And they laughed. My son-in-law leaned further back, puffed his chest like a rooster in a barnyard, and smirked as if he had just won something. He tapped his fork against the edge of his plate, enjoying the attention. He wanted to humiliate me. He wanted me small. And for a moment, I almost gave him what he wanted. I almost lowered my head and let his words sink into my skin like acid. But instead, I smiled. It wasn't a cheerful smile. It wasn't the smile of a woman amused by a harmless joke. No, this smile came from deep inside me, from a place that had been battered and bruised for years. It was the smile of a woman who had been underestimated, mocked, and dismissed for far too long. Inside, my thoughts were burning. Loser. Was I a loser when I worked 2 jobs just to make sure my children had shoes on their feet? Was I a loser when I walked to work in the rain so they could take the family car? Was I a loser when I stayed awake at night sewing up torn clothes, when I skipped meals to make sure they never went hungry, when I held their hands through heartbreak, through sickness, through failure? No, I wasn't the loser here. The real losers were the ones laughing at their own mother, the ones who couldn't see the worth of the woman who had given them everything. But I didn't say those words aloud. Not yet. Because silence has power. And in that silence, I made a decision that would change everything. I would no longer tolerate the disrespect. As they laughed, I studied their faces. My daughter, eyes glittering with amusement, had once clung to me in fear of the dark. My son, who chuckled into his glass, had once cried in my arms when he was bullied at school. And now here they were, grown, married, and too blind to see the cruelty in mocking the one who had lifted them higher than she ever lifted herself. My son-in-law took another sip of wine, then leaned forward, emboldened by their laughter. "You've got nothing to your name," he sneered. "Living off scraps, just wasting away. Tell me, don't you ever feel embarrassed?" His words were sharp, cutting, and calculated. He wanted me to flinch. He wanted me to break. But I didn't. Instead, I looked straight at him. My smile didn't waver. My eyes, though, burned with a fire he didn't recognize. Inside, my heart ached, but alongside the pain was clarity. The years of sacrifice, the endless giving, the quiet endurance of insults. They had brought me to this very moment. And suddenly, I understood. I was done. Done being the silent provider. Done being the easy target. Done letting them strip away my dignity one mocking word at a time. I remembered the nights I had gone without sleep, worrying about bills. I remembered the times I picked up the phone when they called, begging for help with rent, car payments, groceries. I remembered wiring them money, selling my jewelry, pawning my wedding band, everything I could to keep them afloat. And now? Now they sat here laughing at me. It was almost laughable itself, the irony of it. They thought I was powerless. They thought I was defeated. They thought I was the fool. But deep down, I carried a truth that none of them knew. A truth that would one day turn the tables so completely they would never laugh again. So I sat there, letting them revel in their cruelty, letting their laughter echo around me. Because I knew something they didn't. This was the last time they would ever laugh at me. The pain was still there, buried beneath my calm smile, but the decision had been made. I would rise. And when I did, they would finally learn who the real loser was. There is something people never tell you about motherhood. They never tell you about the weight you will carry, not just on your back, but on your soul. They never tell you that when you bring a child into this world, you also sign an unspoken contract with sacrifice. And I honored that contract every single day of my life. When my children were little, I stretched every dollar like it was elastic. I remember sitting at the kitchen table with a stack of bills, the electricity notice stamped in red, the rent past due, and my paycheck already gone before it even arrived. I would hold my head in my hands and wonder how I would make it work. Some nights, the only way to make the numbers line up was to cut myself out of the equation. If there were 3 pieces of chicken, I took none. If there was milk in the fridge, it went into their cereal bowls, never in my coffee. If there was only enough gas in the car to get one person somewhere, it got them to school, not me to work. I walked, I endured, I stayed hungry. And they never knew. They never saw the meals I skipped. They never noticed how I wore the same coat winter after winter, while they got new ones each year. They never asked why my shoes had holes in them, or why I always said I wasn't hungry at dinner time. They thought I was full. They thought I was strong. And maybe I was, but strength doesn't erase hunger. It doesn't pay bills. There were nights when the silence in my bedroom was filled with the sound of me crying into my pillow, muffling the sobs so they wouldn't hear. Because mothers don't cry, do they? We're supposed to be unshakable, untouchable, the pillar everyone leans on. But pillars crack. I worked jobs that most people wouldn't touch, cleaning offices at night, flipping burgers at dawn, sewing clothes until my fingers bled. I remember one winter when I worked double shifts, coming home so exhausted I could barely stand. My hands shook as I unlocked the door, but the moment I saw their faces, I forced a smile. And that smile became my mask. They never saw the exhaustion. They never saw the ache in my body. They never saw the blisters on my feet. They only saw the lunches packed, the clothes washed, the lights still on. Somehow. But here's the cruel part. When sacrifice becomes routine, it stops being seen. My children grew up thinking it was normal to have shoes appear when theirs wore out. They thought it was expected to have money appear for field trips, sports, and birthdays. They didn't know those dollars came from nights I spent on my knees scrubbing floors. They didn't know those cakes came from me skipping lunch that week. They just assumed. Assumed the world worked that way. Assumed their mother would always find a way. And I did. Until the bitterness began to seep in. Not because I regretted loving them. Not because I begrudged their joy. No. I was bitter because my sacrifices were invisible. Because the people I loved most in this world thought the roof over their heads, the food on their plates, the clothes on their backs, all just appeared. They never thought of the price. I remember one Christmas especially. Money was tighter than ever. I had saved coins in a jar all year long, nickels and dimes scraped together from returning cans and bottles. When the jar was full, I poured it out on the table, counting every cent, praying it would be enough for something under the tree. That year, I didn't buy myself a coat, even though mine was tearing at the seams. I didn't fix my teeth, even though the pain was unbearable. Every cent went into wrapping paper and toys. And when they woke up Christmas morning, their eyes lit up. They squealed with joy. They ripped open boxes, and they never once looked at me. Not once. I sat on the couch, smiling with pride but crying silently inside, because they didn't see the woman behind the gifts. They only saw the gifts. Years passed, and the pattern continued. Every time they called for help, I answered. Rent overdue? I wired the money. Car broken down? I pawned my jewelry. Groceries short? I filled their cabinets while leaving my own fridge empty. And the cruelest part? They stopped saying thank you. Gratitude became rare. Entitlement became normal. Somewhere along the way, my children stopped seeing me as their mother, the woman who had sacrificed everything for them, and started seeing me as a safety net. Always there, always ready, always giving. And if I'm honest, a part of me allowed it. Because that's what mothers do, right? We give. We break ourselves into pieces and hand them over, believing our children will one day understand, one day appreciate. But that day never came. Instead, I grew older. My back ached more. My hands stiffened with arthritis. My paychecks shrank while their demands grew. And still, they laughed. Still, they dismissed me. Still, they called me names. Blind to the truth of who I was and what I had done, the bitterness grew like a shadow in my heart. Not because I stopped loving them. No, I could never stop loving my children. The bitterness came because I finally saw the truth. They didn't value me. They valued what I gave them. And the difference between those two things is everything. I had become invisible. My years of sacrifice had become their expectation. My love had become their entitlement. And as I sat at that dinner table, listening to their laughter echo against the walls, I realized the cruelest truth of all. The very people I had sacrificed everything for were the ones who now mocked me the most. There's a saying I've heard all my life. Mothers give everything and keep nothing. And for the longest time, that was me. I gave and gave until there was almost nothing left of me. My children took what they needed. My husband, God rest his soul, leaned on me more than I ever admitted. And life itself drained me with one bill, one emergency, one sacrifice after another. But here's the truth they never knew. I wasn't just giving. I was also quietly keeping. You see, after years of carrying everyone else's burdens, I learned one thing. If I didn't protect myself, no one else would. It started small, a single dollar here, a $5 bill there. I slipped them into an old coffee tin in the pantry, behind the flour canisters where no one ever looked. At first, it felt almost shameful. I told myself I was selfish, that I should be using every penny for my children. But then I remembered the nights when they laughed while I sat hungry, the times when they spent freely while I worked myself raw. So I kept saving. When I worked late nights cleaning offices, I pocketed a little from the overtime. When I sewed clothes for neighbors, I stashed away the cash. When I skipped meals, I told myself, This is not just sacrifice. This is building something. And slowly, that coffee tin grew heavy. Eventually, I moved it into a small lockbox. Then, when it became too much to hide in the house, I opened a bank account in my name only. No one else knew. No one else asked. Why would they? In their minds, I was barely surviving. A poor woman with no ambition. A loser, as my son-in-law so cruelly said. But behind their backs, I was building independence. Over the years, I learned how to stretch a dollar, but I also learned how to grow one. I read, I asked questions, I watched the way money moved in this world. When my late husband passed, everyone assumed I was left with nothing. They thought he hadn't left me a dime. What they didn't know was that I had invested small amounts in places no one ever suspected. Certificates of deposit, savings bonds, even a little real estate. It wasn't flashy, it wasn't loud, but it was steady. And while my children lived their lives thinking I was their safety net, I was quietly weaving one of my own. When my son came asking for help with rent, I gave it. But I also deposited $20 into my hidden account. When my daughter begged for money to fix her car, I handed her the cash, and then slipped a portion into my savings before she ever knew. To them, I was always broke, always scrambling, always just barely holding it together. And I let them think that, because it was easier for them to believe I was weak. Easier for them to mock me than to imagine I had power they couldn't touch. But deep down, I knew the truth. The truth was that while they were living recklessly, spending every dollar depending on me and then laughing at me, I was quietly securing a future for myself. I remember sitting at the bank one afternoon, signing papers for a savings account in my own name. The clerk looked at me surprised. "Ma'am," he said, "you've been making deposits for years. You've built quite a nest egg." And I just smiled, because that's what they never understood. I wasn't the fool they thought I was. I wasn't just some old woman waiting to die, living hand to mouth. No, I was patient. I was careful. I was silent. And in that silence, I became powerful. My family never asked questions because they didn't care. They thought they knew everything there was to know about me. They thought I was transparent, predictable, simple. But I had secrets. The kind of secrets that would one day shatter the way they looked at me. The kind of secrets that would make them realize the person they had mocked, dismissed, and overlooked had more control than they ever dreamed. For years, I hid those secrets in plain sight. A modest apartment, simple clothes, an old car. Let them believe I was struggling. Let them laugh at my so-called failures. What they didn't realize was that every time they laughed, I was building something stronger, something they could never take from me. I paid their bills, yes. I wired them money, yes. But while I gave, I also guarded. Every sacrifice I made for them, I matched with a promise to myself. Never again will I be left with nothing. So I built my independence brick by brick, dollar by dollar, sacrifice by sacrifice. They never noticed when I stayed late at work, not just for them, but for me. They never noticed when I declined invitations, choosing instead to save the gas money. They never noticed the quiet investments, the small accounts, the way I turned scraps into security. Because they weren't looking. And perhaps that was my greatest advantage, their blindness. They were so sure of my weakness, so sure of my dependence that they never once thought to look deeper. If they had, they might have seen the fire in my eyes, the steel in my spine, the truth I carried like a hidden weapon. But they didn't. And so my secret remained safe. There's a strange kind of freedom in being underestimated. When people think you are powerless, you can move quietly, make choices, and build strength in the shadows. And when the time comes to finally reveal that strength, the shock on their faces is sweeter than anything in this world. At that dinner table, when my son-in-law laughed, when my children joined in, when they called me a loser, They thought they knew everything about me. But the truth was simple. I had lived a double life. The life they saw, tired, broke, dependent, and the life they never saw, independent, steady, quietly powerful. And though I sat there in silence, smiling at their mockery, inside I held a secret that would one day silence them all. Because the woman they thought was weak was the woman who held the power to change everything. The room was still filled with laughter, but I no longer heard it the same way. Each chuckle, each snicker, each mocking glance across that long wooden table, they no longer sounded like voices I knew. They sounded like echoes from strangers. Strangers who had lived off my sacrifice, strangers who had eaten the meals I cooked, strangers who had slept soundly under roofs I paid for. But in that moment, they weren't my children. They weren't my family. They were something else. And that was the night everything changed. I looked at them, one by one. My son-in-law with his smug grin and glass of wine raised like a trophy. My daughter, eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of being on his side. My son, who chuckled into his napkin as though mocking me were an inside joke. Even the grandchildren, confused but giggling along because children mimic the adults they trust. They thought it was funny. They thought it was harmless. But to me, it was betrayal. It wasn't the first time they had disrespected me. No, this dinner was only the culmination of years of small insults, dismissive glances, ungrateful sighs, and cruel remarks hidden behind laughter. I had endured it, swallowed it, told myself it didn't matter. But that night, I felt the weight of every insult crashing down all at once. And for the first time, I refused to carry it anymore. I smiled, the same smile that had carried me through years of sacrifice, the same smile that had hidden my hunger, my exhaustion, my pain. But this time, that smile was not for survival. This time, my smile was for war. They didn't see it. They were too busy laughing. They didn't see how my fingers clenched lightly around my fork, how my eyes narrowed just slightly, how the corners of my lips curved upward, not in amusement but in resolve. Inside, I was making a promise. This ends tonight. They would never hear me beg again. They would never see me bend again. They would never mistake my silence for weakness again. Because I had decided, I would cut them off. Every bill I had paid, every wire transfer, every emergency rescue, it would all stop. No more late-night phone calls asking for money. No more checks slipped under their doors. No more groceries delivered to their homes while mine sat empty. I would no longer be their crutch. As they laughed at me, as my son-in-law called me a loser, once again for good measure, I realized something powerful. They needed me far more than I ever needed them. And the moment I pulled away, the moment I stepped back, their carefully built lives, built on my back, on my sacrifices, on my steady hand, would crumble. That realization filled me with a strange calm, a calm so deep that my smile almost turned genuine, because I knew the truth, and the truth was this. I held the power, not them, not their smug laughter, not their cruel words. Me. And they had no idea. I leaned back in my chair, listening to the sound of their forks scraping plates, the sound of their careless laughter bouncing off the walls. Every sound was fuel to the fire burning inside me. They thought they had humiliated me. They thought they had won. But what they didn't realize was that in humiliating me, they had awakened something far more dangerous. My resolve. For years, I had allowed them to take and take. I had let them treat me as if my love was bottomless, my resources endless, my spirit unbreakable. I had given them everything because I thought that's what mothers were supposed to do. But that night, I learned a new truth. Mothers are not supposed to be doormats. Mothers are not supposed to be banks. Mothers are not supposed to be laughed at by the very children they raised. I pressed my napkin to my lips, hiding the smirk that threatened to break free. They thought I was still quiet, still small, still powerless. They thought my silence meant defeat. But my silence was planning. Inside my mind, I began laying the pieces of what would come next. First, I would close my checkbook, let them struggle with their bills. Let them face the late notices, the eviction threats, the broken cars, the empty refrigerators. Second, I would remind them, not with words, but with actions, that I was not the fool they thought I was. And finally, I would show them the depth of their mistake. Because when a woman has been silent for too long, her voice becomes thunder. And when a mother who has given everything finally decides she's had enough, nothing in this world can stop her. The dinner dragged on, their laughter echoing as though the cruelty of the moment hadn't touched them at all. Plates were cleared, desserts brought out, wine glasses refilled. They carried on oblivious. But for me, time slowed. I studied each of them, memorizing the smugness in their faces, the casual disregard in their voices. These would be the memories that fueled me. These would be the reminders when I needed strength later. Every cruel laugh, every mocking word, every dismissive glance. I stored them away like ammunition. They would learn. Not tonight, not tomorrow, but soon. And when they did, their laughter would die in their throats. Their arrogance would crumble. Their smug faces would pale. Because that night, as I sat there smiling quietly, I had crossed the breaking point. There was no going back. The woman they thought was powerless, the woman they thought was weak, the loser they laughed at, had made a decision. And when the decision of a mother hardens into resolve, it becomes unstoppable. So I smiled. I passed the breadbasket, I sipped my water. I let them laugh. All the while I planned. And in that silence, I became more powerful than I had ever been in my life, because they thought I was defeated. But the truth was, I was only just beginning. The plates were cleared, the wine glasses refilled, and the laughter still lingered in the air like smoke after a fire. But inside me, the fire had already burned itself into something else. Something sharper. Something final. I sat there, quiet, patient, letting them believe they had broken me. Letting them think that their laughter had buried me. But what they didn't understand was that I had been waiting for this very moment, the moment where silence could finally give way to truth. I placed my fork down gently, folded my napkin with care, and looked around the table. The chatter died down just a little, the way it does when someone senses a shift in the air. My children's voices faded. Even the grandchildren's little giggles grew quieter. I lifted my head, and my eyes landed squarely on the man who had started it all, my son-in-law. He sat there smug, his wine glass dangling between his fingers, his laughter still playing on his lips. He didn't know that he was about to choke on that laughter. I leaned forward, my voice calm but firm, and asked, "How does it feel to know that this loser will no longer pay your bills?" The words struck the air like thunder. The table went still. Forks froze mid-air. My daughter's smile vanished. My son stopped breathing for a moment. And my son-in-law, the great mocker, the arrogant man who had called me worthless, turned pale. His smugness drained from his face as though someone had ripped the ground out from beneath him. His eyes darted around the table, desperate for someone to laugh, someone to rescue him, someone to make my words into a joke. But no one did. No one dared. Because in that moment, they all knew. I wasn't joking. For the first time in years, the laughter belonged to me. Not in sound, but in power. The silence was deafening. And I let it stretch. Because silence is a weapon. And that night, I wielded it with precision. My son-in-law cleared his throat, stammering as though searching for the right words. "Well, what do you mean?" he asked, his voice weaker now, stripped of arrogance. I sat back, calm, composed, my smile still resting on my lips. "I mean exactly what I said," I replied. "I will no longer pay your bills. I will no longer rescue you. I will no longer sacrifice for people who mock the very hands that fed them." My daughter blinked. her lips parting in disbelief. "Mom, you don't mean that," she whispered, but even she sounded unsure, as though part of her knew I did. I turned my gaze on her, steady and unwavering. "I mean every word." And in that moment, for the first time in decades, I felt the weight lift from my shoulders. The years of sacrifice, the endless giving, the cruel laughter at that dinner table, all of it washed away as I spoke the truth. I wasn't just cutting them off financially. I was reclaiming my dignity. My son-in-law shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face now as pale as the tablecloth beneath his plate. He had built his confidence on the belief that I was weak, that I was dependent, that I would always be there to foot the bill. He had strutted through life thinking he had power over me. But now he knew the truth. The truth was that I had the power all along. I saw it in his eyes, the realization, the panic, the fear. He knew what my words meant. He knew that without my help, his carefully constructed world was about to collapse. And that was the sweetest justice of all. Not revenge by anger, not revenge by shouting, but revenge by truth. The kind of truth no one could laugh at. My children sat in silence too. Their faces told stories of their own. Shock, disbelief, shame. And though none of them spoke, I could feel their thoughts pressing down on them. They were replaying every time they had called me, every time they had asked for money, every time they had assumed I would save them. And now they knew. That safety net was gone. I let the silence linger a moment longer, then I pushed back my chair and stood. My knees ached, but my spine was straighter than it had been in years. I felt taller, stronger, lighter. I looked down at them, my family, my betrayers, my children who had taken me for granted, and I spoke one last time. "I gave you everything. My time, my health, my money, my love. And you laughed at me. You mocked me. You called me a loser. But hear me now. That loser is done. From this day forward, you are on your own." No one spoke. No one dared. I picked up my coat from the back of my chair, draped it over my shoulders, and walked toward the door. Each step felt like freedom. Each step felt like reclaiming the years they had stolen from me. Behind me, I could hear whispers, stammered protests, nervous laughter trying to restart. But it was too late. The spell had been broken. The balance of power had shifted. I was no longer the invisible mother, the silent provider, the easy target. I was a woman who had finally taken control, and as I closed the door behind me, leaving them in stunned silence, I smiled once more. Not the forced smile I had worn for years. Not the smile of a woman hiding her pain. This time it was the smile of victory. Because my revenge wasn't loud. It wasn't violent. It wasn't cruel. It was quiet. Simple. Absolute. The sweetest revenge of all. Sometimes silence is the sharpest weapon, and a smile is the strongest shield. That night, I didn't raise my voice. I didn't beg for their understanding. I didn't fight for their approval. I simply chose to stop giving, to stop sacrificing for people who only knew how to take. And in that silence, I found my strength. For years, I believed love meant sacrifice, that a mother's role was to endure quietly, to give without end, to carry burdens even when her back broke under the weight. But I learned the hardest truth of all. When respect is gone, sacrifice becomes slavery. My children thought they could laugh at me forever, that my love was an endless fountain. But fountains run dry when poisoned with betrayal. I walked away from that table with nothing but my dignity, and it was more valuable than every dollar I had ever given them. To any mother listening now, hear me. Love is sacred, but so is respect. When they mock your sacrifice, when they take your kindness for weakness, you are not obligated to continue. Sometimes the greatest revenge is finally choosing yourself.